All right, it's the honey man himself.
What's up?
So, Cole, why should all marketers be writers?
That's a great question. So from my experience, I well, for those who don't know, I'm a
No,
copywriter
don't do any of that.
and
It's just you and me talking.
okay, cool.
There's no for
Uh,
those you don't know. It's just you
okay,
and me. Forget there's an audience. We'll start.
yeah.
I'll ask you the question again.
All right, let's restart.
So, hey, Cole, why should all marketers be writers?
Great question. I would say all marketers should be writers. Because the vast majority of business writing and marketing communication, uh, to be honest, is just really tough to read. And and I would say primarily because it's just littered with sort of business jargon and buzzwords and sort of this I hate to say it, but kind of like this showboating is what I feel like when I read a lot of brands writing. And it doesn't feel like something that can be understood by like the wider audience. So I think if more marketers focused on writing better and crisper and clearer, their marketing would improve because there'd be greater comprehension.
Well, yeah, said in a maybe less nice way. There's a lot of companies you can't understand what the fuck they're talking about. You go to a company's website, you can't figure out what they do, right? It's like, well,
Oh yeah.
and in the B2B space, it's even worse because it's just full of business babble. One of the things that I love to do is read the about section of a company's press release. And, most of them are ridiculous.
Oh yeah, it's really rough. And I think like for one way to like improve the about us section is just to remove the word about us. I think that's like a great way to just quickly improve like the about us section. But one
So
thing,
instead of about us, what would you say in the press release in the about us section?
oh, I would just have a really, badass headline, something that like speaks to the reader. And one thing like I notice constantly with brands, especially like in the about us section, is they sort of write in this really awkward, clunky third person. It's like Nike might say, Nike is a global sports brands and we serve our customers in blah blah blah, and that doesn't speak to the reader. It almost as like the customer or prospect, when you read that, you are kind of thinking, am I like reading Nike narrating their own story here? So I think like one way to just improve the about us section is, one, delete that term entirely, but two, just change it to like first person, say I and we, and actually speak to the reader, like say you versus saying our customers. I just think that's super strange.
And I found it interesting how, when you rewrote Lochhead.com, you were insistent that it was in the first person voice. Why do you think so I get that with me, although I was uncomfortable with it, but I get it.
Hmm,
Why do you
hmm.
think that's also true for a mega brand like a Nike?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, and I knew you were a little bit, for those who don't know, Christopher's very modest. And if you try to have him brag about himself, you'll get a lot of pushback. but from my experience, I kind of relate it to sort of like the dinner party. If you had someone walk into a dinner party, and they started talking about themselves in third person, it would be incredibly uncomfortable. You would think, wow, this person's like kind of pompous, right? And so when brands take that same approach and they start talking about themselves in third person, as a reader or a prospective customer, we're just kind of scratching our heads like, why are they talking that way? And I think for any brand, be it like big or small, the goal is for when someone sits down and reads their emails or their website copy or anything, we really want to feel like we're talking to another human being, right? Nike should sound like it's a person. It shouldn't sound like it's coming from this collection of thousands of like people, right? And I think like the strongest brands that I know, uh, they feel like people to us. Like they feel like we're having a conversation over a beer or over coffee. And so that's why I think we have to shy away from third person.
It's so interesting that you say that because I had so many takeaways when from my conversation with Max Temkin when he was on Follow Your Different.
Mhm.
And for them, Cards Against Humanity is like a person, and there's certain characteristics and behaviors that fit, and there's some
Mhm.
that don't. And like when they talk to the world, they make an assumption that the world is in on the nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that this is not necessarily how they would talk to you if they met you as people, but that essentially Cards Against Humanity is a person, is a character. And
Mhm.
so you think even a mega brand like Nike should talk like it was a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I sit down like with a brand and we're actually trying to carve out their voice, one thing I work with them on is just uh stepping back from the brand and saying, if our brand was a person, what conversations would they have over dinner? What music would they listen to? Would they curse? Would they not curse? What clothes would they wear? And the same goes for the reader too. Like the customer is, who are we writing to? Stephen King, just like a killer writer. He has always he calls it like your ideal writer. So every single novel that Stephen King has been written to his wife, who's also a novelist and like super talented. But every single novel he writes is written directly to her. So like as brands, when not just when we're writing, but when we're marketing, I think it's not just important to think about like who are we as an individual, but also who is our ideal customer that we are writing and marketing to. And almost having that person's like face in our minds as we're marketing and writing to them, because it just creates this much more personable style of marketing. And I loved how you brought up Cards Against Humanity. I think their marketing really speaks to this. Like I read the other day that they bought out their Chinese production plant one time. Like they raised money and then bought out their Chinese production plant for an entire week. So all of the Chinese workers could go on like a week-long vacation, which no brand would ever think to do that. But that to me, like that's a deed, like a marketing deed that feels like something a human would do. And so I think when you take that mindset, you really establish this really refreshing approach to marketing.
It's so interesting you say that because, as a dyslexic, for me, writing is hard, and learning to write has come much, much later in life. I remember when I was in my
Hmm.
early 30s, in my second CMO gig at a company called Scient, the CEO asked me to write essentially the company's point of view and like a paper on that. So imagine like an
Hmm.
HBR article kind of. Um, and so I went to work on the first draft and I gave it to him. And I was probably, 32-ish at the time.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think we were public yet, but we would become public. Anyway, I handed it to him and he read it and he came back to me and he didn't mean this in a mean way at all. His name was Bob Howe, and Bob's a wonderful, warm man I respect deeply. But he said to me, he said, "Christopher, I got it. We need to get you some help here with this, or a writer that you can work with." And he said,
Hmm.
I got to tell you, I've never met anybody who verbally had such skill and with writing had such little skill. He said the disparity between the way you talk and the way you write is the biggest disparity I've ever seen. And he said, look, do whatever you want. I get it. But if you could get your writing skill anywhere near your speaking skill, you'd really have something. And he said it in a very kind way. And he was like an uncle or maybe even dad like figure for me, right? And we had a very playful relationship.
Hmm.
Anyway, that stayed with me. And shortly thereafter, I began working on it. And the aha that I've had is, as a marketeer, I think the two seminal skills are writing and selling. Because in
Hmm.
both cases, you have to be an effective communicator that drives some kind of an outcome. And so anyway, being a good writer, becoming a decent writer has transformed my career and my skill set.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I Completely agree with that. And one thing I've noticed is that I feel like there's very few people who are skilled at both writing and then also speaking. I don't know if you've ever listened to writers do interviews, and I would even batch myself into this, but if you listen to Stephen King do an interview, or you listen to some of these really prominent writers do interviews, you can tell that they're not necessarily in their element. So I think it's skills that you sort of have to hone. You know, I think speaking takes, for some people, speaking comes very, very natural, you know, and the same could be said for writing, but I think they at times do feel a little bit mutually exclusive because they do require a lot of work, you know.
And so if I wanted to be like Cole, what are a couple of things you would tell me to start working on to become a legendary, and in particular, a legendary marketing oriented writer?
Yeah, so the first thing I would recommend is you need to establish what your voice is, right, as a writer. And one piece of advice I give to a lot of marketers who are wanting to improve the writing is one, when you sit down to write, before you write, like before you're writing sales copy, pull out your phone, start recording, and record yourself selling what you're selling to an imaginary customer in front of you. Play it back, and when you play it back, you're going to hear some gems in there. You're gonna be like, "Holy shit, that was a really awesome line there. Like, I need to write that down." And it allows you to take that conversational tone that you're having, that sort of the natural sort of rhythm and cadence that you have when you're speaking. It allows you to translate that and put that down on paper. So I still do that. Like when I get stuck writing, is if I were to sell this to someone, right, just, you know, face to face, how would I sell it to them? So I think that's a quick way to just improve your writing, and it keeps you from writing with some of the bullshit that you talk about, where to make a long story shorter, you know, it when you start speaking and saying that type of stuff, and then you listen to it, all of a sudden you're able to, like, when you listen to it back, all of a sudden you're able to hear, oh, that's a really stupid line. And when you're just writing it, sometimes it's easy to fall in the habit of using those business buzzwords like working in silos and at the end of the day, and all of these different lines. But when you're speaking it and you're hearing it back, I think it automatically like will help improve your communication. Another thing like I highly recommend, and this is sort of a practice for all copywriters, but some of the most prolific copywriters of all time would actually write word for word the biggest, most successful advertisements. So like one of the best sort of written advertisements of all time was David Ogilvy's ad, "How to Create Advertising That Sells." That was like one of the best like examples of copywriting, in my opinion, long form copywriting. So if you're wanting to improve as a copywriter, start literally writing word for word, just copying that advertisement to paper. And naturally, like subconsciously, you are going to be picking up on the rhythm. Stephen King would actually like do this with novels. So he would literally rewrite entire novels word for word to get their rhythm down. And what was crazy about it is by doing that over and over again, you slowly learn, like subconsciously learn the rhythm and skill and cadence that is required to write really well. And obviously don't copy that and publish it, like that's plagiarizing, but it's the same as like I played basketball in high school and a little bit in college. How I got good at basketball is I would watch NBA basketball players do certain moves, and then I would go out to my outdoor basketball goal and I would do those same moves, right? It's the same thing. It's getting your body and your mind used to what that rhythm feels like and
Well,
looks like.
it's exactly what happens in music.
Hmm.
Most people don't, if you're learning to play guitar or piano, most people start off learning other people's songs.
Hmm.
And if you're going to write your own songs, well, if you've been in a cover band and you've been playing, 3 hours at weddings on the weekend or nightclubs or whatever,
Hmm.
you now know how the Beatles constructed their songs and the Stones construct, or if you're doing modern stuff, like Kelly Clarkson's music is really well written. And so I remember hearing Dave Grohl talk about his number one influence for songwriting was the Bee Gees. Because and I'd never
Mhm.
thought about this, but if you listen to a Bee Gees
Mhm.
song, what's the chorus and what's the verse? They just build on top of each other, and they get catchier and catchier. And really, a lot of Bee Gees songs are 4 or 5 catchy things stacked on top of each other, all of which could potentially be a verse or a chorus. Anyway, just
Mhm.
talking about that influence, I had never heard it in the context of writing, that as a writer, you would sit there and write out ads in marketing or novels or whatever it is that inspire you, and literally copy them to begin imprinting that on your brain.
Exactly. I mean, if you looked back on like my early notebooks when I was first getting started, Gary Halbert and Joe Sugarman and David Ogilvy. I mean, if you read through David Ogilvy's work, I like so much of my tone has been inspired by people like David Ogilvy and Hemingway. And I obviously will never in a million years touch their skill level, but when you're writing word for word what they've written in the past, you're naturally just imprint, like you said, imprinting that shit like on your brain, you know.
Amazing. The other thing I have to take my hat off to you about, Cole, is and I wish I could remember who turned me on to you so I could thank them, but somebody told me about you. I went to your website. I was knocked over. I immediately got it and subscribed to the newsletter, which I fucking love. And so I start consuming your shit. And by the time I am in a position to need someone like you, it's like, well, duh, I'm going to send Cole an email. Like you and I hadn't really, we'd emailed back and forth because you started listening to the podcast. And so we were starting to have some fun together and build a bit of a relationship. But at the beginning, I didn't think I'd end up hiring you. But then I was like, well, what? Let's try this guy. And the craziest thing, and I think is a testament to legendary marketing, branding, communications, and writing all kind of wrapped into one. Your work is so representative of who you are. I knew you before we ever actually talked.
Well, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that with Honey Copy and building out that brand, the approach I've tried to take, and it's been because I haven't had, traditional education with copywriting, right? Like I went to school for marketing, but it's not like I went to a portfolio school and learned about copywriting and sort of learned the rules and all that. And I think my approach to building Honey Copy has been just trying to be as authentic as possible to who I am, and unapologetically so. And so, I mean, you've read my newsletter sticky notes, and I mean, you like every time I send out a newsletter, I lose 40 to 50 followers, but thankfully I'm gaining a lot more than that. But I lose 40 to 50 subscribers. I had a woman say something to me the other day. She emailed me and said, "You curse in this, and it's appalling, and I'm unsubscribe me," which I thought was funny because she could just unsubscribe at the bottom. But at first, I kind of had some pause over that, where I thought, is it appropriate for me to curse in a marketing newsletter? And what I realized is, if I were having a conversation with one of my friends over beer, and I didn't say one single curse word that entire beer, they would pull me aside and say, "Dude, is there something wrong with you? Like, what's going on?" And so I try to just be unapologetically me, and I don't try to showboat. I don't try to be someone I'm not. And sometimes that turns people off, but what I've realized is it's created a really loyal uh, readership, because I think they realize that I'm not trying to be someone else, or sort of throw on the business facade where,
Yeah.
we're going to button everything up and pretend that we don't fuck and we don't cuss and we don't drink or smoke or anything like that. That's just, I think that life and business can kind of mesh a little more than, than what we're currently doing. But that's probably a conversation for another day.
Well, I think you do a great job at it. And like I said, I knew you uh, before we talked, and it's because your work is very clear that way. All right, Cole. Anything else on your mind about how to be a legendary, or at least how to get started on the path to be a legendary marketing writer?
I would say probably the last thing I would leave people with is read less of the sort of blogs you're seeing on Medium and less of the rah uh, business BS, and pick up some of the classics. Like, so pick up books that Ernest Hemingway has written. Pick up Virginia Woolf. Pick up and read really, really good writing. And again, Stephen King said it best, but he essentially said that if I had a dollar for every for every aspiring writer that came to me that said they didn't have time to read, I would have I'd have enough money to buy a very good steak dinner. And he finished that by essentially saying, if you don't have time to read, you don't have the tools to become a really good writer. And what's fascinating is Stephen King is, I think he's 80 now. He reads 75 to 100 books every single year. And so that's what I would tell people, if whether it's writing or podcasting or whatever craft you're trying to do, um, just absorb really, really, really good art in that specific field. And so if you want to become a great writer, don't read bad writing. Pick up a really good book, look up the best writers of all time, start reading there. And I think naturally it will imprint on your brain. So that's what I'd leave folks with.
Cole Schaefer, there's a reason you're a legend. Thank you, brother.
You're welcome. Thank you.